Great. Thanks everyone for joining the February Salesforce Healthcare User Group session. We're going to focus today on fun topics around security and Salesforce Shield. And for those who are not familiar with the user group, the healthcare user group is really for folks who are in the Salesforce industry or in the healthcare industry using Salesforce. And this really is an opportunity for us to all come together. Everyone's welcome. We learn from each other, help each other, and use technology to solve healthcare challenges that I think everyone can appreciate. Next slide. Briefly, the co-leaders are myself, Melissa Malweitzer, Tina, and Corinne. And we're going to get to some special guests and allow them to introduce themselves before we get to the good part and the reason why everyone truly is here.
Awesome, thank you. So Jordan Seeley, I'm a solution architect at Slalom. My background is in largely healthcare. I have a degree from biomedical engineering, and I've spent the last 5 years in the Salesforce ecosystem implementing a variety of different Salesforce tools and solutions for pharmaceutical life science companies, payers, providers, all of that in the healthcare industry. Really came in on the core CRM side of it. So community, sales, service, health cloud, back when the recommendation was to use individual object model as opposed to person accounts. A lot of the work that I do now is actually cross-cloud work as well. So excited to talk a little bit about the experiences that I've had in relation to Shield and kind of demystify a little bit of this topic for anybody that's interested in learning more. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Amanda.
Hi there, nice to see everyone. Thank you all for joining today. My name's Amanda. I am the lead product manager over the Shield and Security Center product areas. And as you can see here, my background's in security, so this is my kind of core expertise area. And Tina invited me to join today to share some of the roadmap with you, so that's why I'm here today.
Oh, hi, everybody. My name is Doug Cox. I'm a security architect here at Salesforce. I work on a team that discusses security that you can get out of the box with Salesforce, and also security you can use to lift yourself to a higher level of compliance, as in Shield, like we'll be talking about today. It's great to see everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm going to take over from here. We're going to talk first about Salesforce Security Native. And for those who've been working with Salesforce for a while, Salesforce natively has a lot of security already built into it. If we look at the diagram over here, we have infrastructure services, network services, and application services. Not only has Salesforce provided all the tools for a very robust, secure environment, they also provide best practices. For example, the big push is enabling multi-factor authentication. They have a security health check that you can run on your org. Many other best practices. The resources that Salesforce has made available to its customers and users is there is a Salesforce security guide. When you get this deck, please click on the link and pursue that. There's also a really, really robust Salesforce security on the trust side. If you have not taken a chance to look into that, I'm really impressed with the education, either from the admin track or the developer track. So Salesforce really already out of the box has great native security. Okay, great. Why do we need Shield? Well, there's two categories of data that needs extra security. So if you're already in healthcare, humor this slide deck because, and this is another slide, because those of you who are not familiar with healthcare, this is really important for you to understand. The first category is personally identifiable information, PII, is any data that's used to contact, locate, or identify a specific individual. There's not a checklist for PII, it's more context. So two scenarios. I have the name of a person, Jones, and their zip code. Well, the zip code's in New York City, and I'm gonna probably find a lot of Jones in that zip code. That doesn't really help me identify that one person. Well, what if I have the name and the zip code, and they're in a city in Kansas that has a population of 200? Well, I have just very clearly identified who that person is. Social Security, clearly identified who that person is. So when you're thinking about PII, it's not so much a checklist, it's more of context. Does this data easily identify or locate someone? What does the information reveal about an individual? Why are you using this data and where are you storing it? This is a deep topic. This link here will take you to great resources to dive deeper into this if you're not familiar with this. The other category that is very much specific to healthcare is PHI, protected health information. It's really about the health condition, past, present, or future, the health care provided, and the payment around that, whether it's past, present, or future. Very complex, very in-depth. There are 18 elements that are identified as that need to be protected. And to learn more, if you're not familiar with this topic, please click on this link when you get the slide deck, because there is a lot of information that revolves around that. Okay, fine, we have protected information, why do we care? Well, other than it's the ethical thing to do, is actually be good data guardians, right? We also have in healthcare breaches, and there's consequences for that. And a Hipaa breach is generally an impermissible use or disclosure under the privacy rule that comprises the security, privacy of the protected health information. That is one very dry statement. We can boil it down a couple ways. First is, does the person viewing the data need to know the data to do their job? We have the nurse, Sally, she's taking care of a patient. She needs to review that patient's medical information because she's actually directly involved with that care. However, we have Donna, a nurse who's 3 floors down in a different area. It's not even related to that patient, but she knows this patient's a neighbor and she wants to find out what's going on with that because she's basically being nosy and snooping. She doesn't have a right to know that. Even though they're both medical professionals, it's not need to know to do their job. That would be a breach. Another aspect is the person viewing the data part of the covered entity or business associate? Basically, is their job and who they work for considered within these definitions covered entity or a business associate agreement? See that link, learn more here, go there. It's very complicated and there's definitions for that. So those two components are making up what is considered the Hipaa breach consequences. And when you have a Hipaa breach, it has to be reported and it's a public reporting. This leads to bad publicity, loss of public trust. The news loves to report breaches. And there are significant fines for breaches. The range of fines can be from $100 to $1.5 million. So it's not just, oh, we should do this because it's the right thing to do. It's also, we should do this because the consequences of not being good data guardians and protecting the data is significant. So we talked about Salesforce native and we've security, and it's pretty extensive. But in this realm of healthcare, a lot of healthcare clients are told when they use Salesforce, we need to pivot to Shield. So we're going to review what makes Shield so special and what it brings, and demystify this a little bit. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead and pivot to Jordan Seeley.
Awesome.
Jordan, let
Thank
me
you,
know
Tina.
when.
You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is a perfect representative example. I love this visual because I often think of Salesforce Shield as the cherry on top. And you can see that it's basically an added service on top of the other native security features within Salesforce that really bulks up the amount of security associated with protecting information like PII that's considered extra sensitive, or PHI, which we definitely consider sensitive in a Salesforce or any context. So with all of that in mind, Shield in and of itself will stand on top of all of those additional native features. So definitely that's probably a topic for another session. We'll focus on the 3 modules within Shield itself today. But a lot of the orchestration of a comprehensive security plan does involve Shield and these other application network and infrastructure services. So with that in mind, from a Shield specific perspective, there's 3 modules that we care about in particular. And those are Field Audit Trail, Platform Encryption, and Event Monitoring. And so I know that we'll talk a little bit more in detail about Platform Encryption. We wanted to start in reverse order with Field Audit Trail and Event Monitoring, because those are a little bit more straightforward and we can cover those. And we want to make sure that at least we cover the basis of some of these different important modules within the grouping of Shield functionality. So with that, we'll take a deeper dive into Field Audit Trail on the next slide. And the way that I like to approach this is Field Audit Trail is essentially analogous of expanding the number of fields that are available to use field history tracking for. So if you're familiar with Salesforce and field history tracking, that allows you to actually capture the state and value for a specific piece of data or an attribute on an object at any date at any time. Again, if you're familiar and you have field history tracking enabled on an object, when something changes for that specific field, it'll actually create a field history log associated with that. So you'll see At this time, this person changed the data from, let's say, first name on a contact, Jordan, to, let's say, Michael. You'll have a record of that specific change, the date that it occurred, and that'll exist for a period of time. What Field Audit Trail does is it increases the number of fields that you have available on each of the different objects that you want to track that history for, from 20 up to 60. And the important part of it from a healthcare compliance standpoint is that it actually increases the number of years that you can store that data for. So by default, Field Audit Trail actually archives the data after 18 months. It basically moves it to a more performant storage of being captured in big objects on the back end of the Salesforce platform. But it retains that information for up to 10 years, which with normal field history tracking, you won't get that level of detail. So that is one of the big benefits of Field Audit Trail from a feature standpoint. If you need to make modifications to specific objects, let's say for accounts, you wanted to capture that field history tracking for 6 months and then move it to big object storage, you can make those modifications. But for all intents and purposes, most customers that I've worked with are perfectly fine with the standard settings. Once Shield is enabled, you'll be able to go in, select additional fields for enabling field history tracking. And then once you actually start modifying records, all of that will be captured and maintained as a part of the feature. So with that, one big tip for Field Audit Trail is actually creating and assigning a permission set to allow for the deletion of the historical information. So when that information is moved into big object storage, you might actually have requests in the future for people to delete any data that you have stored about them. You'll have to accommodate the deletion of the records, both on the contact object, any object that is associated with those individuals, as well as the history that is tracked for those individuals. So you want to make sure that you're also creating and assigning a permission set that allows for the deletion of that information once it's moved to big storage. Any questions on this? I think that we'll pause if there are questions after each module, but from a Field Audit Trail standpoint, that is a high level overview. Anything in the chat?
Nope, doesn't look like it.
All right. Well, let's go to the next slide then.
Those are the fields you want to progress.
Awesome, thank you. So wrapping up on Field Audit Trail, just I guess very quickly since we have it, the objects that are by default for Field Audit Trail, these are the standard objects that you have the ability to actually implement Field Audit Trail for. For the most part, you'll see every object that you'll need here within the context of the healthcare ecosystem. And then the last bullet is we have the custom objects with field history tracking enabled. Basically any custom object that your business or organization uses to support your business processes, that can be set up on that as well. It's all centered around the enabling of field history tracking for those objects. For field specifics, some things that you actually can't check with Field Audit Trail are field types of formula, roll-up summary, or auto number fields. And so some of the back-end technical aspects of this are that Field Audit Trail is really captured on a DML transaction. So when a record is actually committed to the database, that is when the record is evaluated and then the log of the record change is created for that specific record. For things like a formula field that might be referencing another field on that specific object or a cross object, that doesn't actually trigger a DML transaction, and therefore that won't be captured. So a couple small things to keep in mind in relation to the different types of things that you'd like to actually capture when using Field Audit Trail. Is this reportable from Kalyani? It is reportable. Depending on the type of report that you'll want to run, you might have to create a custom report type, but this is reportable. All right, with that, we will move to event monitoring.
There, Corinne, we got some more chats that just came in. Hold on a second,
Yeah, so I see two really good questions. The first one is around Field Audit Trail for system objects in Salesforce, and if that's available.
For system objects of Salesforce. If you have examples of what those system objects would be that you're referencing in particular, Nasir, that would be helpful. If you're talking about things like last modified by, or some of the actual attributes that come on the objects that are reported by the system or created by the system, there are some that are supported and some that aren't from an attribute standpoint.
I think Doug's also nodding his head. Doug, do you have something where you can, on the system objects for that? You're on mute, Doug.
I do not, but I would have to get back on that.
Okay, great, thank you.
And then there's another question from Rakesh about if new standard objects are created in order to store the audit history.
New standard objects are not created to store that. So that's all based off of the field history tracking related list that is associated to those standard objects.
One question that I tend to get a lot from clients is around accessing the information on the field audit trail. And so my understanding is that it's pretty much, you need to access it via the API. So are there other ways to access it, or is that our option?
In relation to once it's moved to archive, API is the standard. I personally don't know of any other ways that you would do it. So API is the way after it's moved into big object storage that I would access it.
Okay. Amanda actually just posted in chat, Field Audit Trail creates a standard big object. So she's recommending to check out the trailhead on big objects. Amanda, did you want to talk a little bit more to that?
Yeah, as Jordan mentioned, it is a big object, so it's not a typical standard object. So the interaction with them is a little different because of the type of architecture. You can run SOQL queries on, but only indexed on a couple of fields. Otherwise, you need to run something called an asynchronous SOQL query, which is just a little bit more complicated to run. But yes, basically the data is reportable, but there are some constraints around how to do that. And then in terms of interacting with the data, correct, it is API only. There is a great app exchange partner called RevCult, and they have an interface that allows you to kind of manage the settings very easily. And they have both a free version and then a paid version, a premium version. So there's different functionalities. That's another good way of like interacting with Field Audit Trail.
Awesome. I do want to, so it's 12:18. I'm going to be a little bit of the time monitor. We're going to have this is the simplest of all three that we're going to discuss. Any questions that we do not hit, we can continue the discussion in the Salesforce Success community, and then we can also get answers there as well. So please, any and all questions, we'll make sure we capture them. But for the time, let's go ahead and now pivot to event monitoring, because we're going from simple to more complex. So let's go ahead and jump into the next. And Doug, thank you for the RevCult link.
Awesome. Thank you, Tina. So moving into event monitoring, essentially this module of Shield helps to actually track and maintain some of the details about performance, security, and really any type of data about the usage of any Salesforce app that you have that you're working on. So the setup process for this is actually after you enable, after you have Shield provision for your org and you enable Einstein Analytics to actually start using Shield event monitoring, you'll go through a setup process that allows you to actually use some of the pre-built dashboards, of which we have several of these listed on the slide. I think there's 14 or 15 in total that come with the standard event monitoring analytics app. But this allows for capturing and logging of all this information and presenting it visually. So essentially, when any type of event happens across some of these categories, all of that will be automatically captured and then visible across a dashboard in Analytics Studio. So as a part of Shield, you'll have a user that is actually able to access Analytics Studio as a part of Einstein and look into these dashboards. That setup process, there's a guided flow for doing so, and you can actually make modifications based off of how long you'd like to retain some of this data, how long you'd like that to be present in the lenses that are associated with each of these dashboards. All of that is a relatively straightforward process. It does require probably some conversation with legal or some of your team members on how long you would actually like that information to be persisted on the dashboards in and of themselves. But what you'll see is on the right side of the screen, there's an example of one of the dashboards in Einstein after it's been set up. And in this case, this is actually the user login dashboard, which showcases which users are logging in, from which IPs, on which frequency, which basis, et cetera. But all of this is readily accessible through that analytics app using that pre-built type of dashboard. With that context, the most important thing that I see clients use event monitoring for is to proactively manage or keep track of some of these important things. So report downloads. If there's any users that are specifically viewing or trying to download a specific report, maybe it contains PII or PHI within your Health Cloud or regular Sales Cloud environment, that can be an important indicator. If they're not supposed to be actually downloading or attempting to download those reports, that can be an important indicator that you would want to follow up on, which might reduce the risk of information that should be maintained in Salesforce and not exported externally, as well as actually accessing things like page views, the reports in and of themselves, or hitting any of the REST API endpoints. So across all of these dashboards, different uses for different use cases, but an important aspect of really tracking and monitoring what's happening in Salesforce as a platform across the different apps that are supporting your business.
Great, Jordan, we have a question.
Sure.
I'm actually, Amanda, I think she's answering. Can this be a replacement for the Dynatrace dashboard? Was that you, Amanda, who had the comment?
Yeah, I think I'm not completely familiar with Dynatrace, but I suspect it may be pulling in more than event monitoring data. So it really depends on the use case. Like there's a ton of really rich data in event monitoring. Not all of it is displayed out of the box in the analytics app. We're actually expanding the number of data sets that you can pull into the analytics app in spring release though, which is good news. So I think it really depends on, you know, exactly what's in Dynatrace, how it's being used, and like if you're able to view exactly the same thing in the analytics app. Potentially, yes. I mean, they're both visualization platforms, but Dynatrace may have additional data sources that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, and I would agree. I've actually had that question come up from other conversations with clients too. I don't think it was specifically Dynatrace. This was a couple of years ago when an organization already had a tool that was external to Salesforce that was doing some type of event monitoring-esque functionality. And the approach that I would take from there is, you know, if you're going to set up event monitoring, do a cross comparison of what you're getting from the analytics types that you're going to be able to visualize and the events that are being tracked within event monitoring itself as a module within Shield. And then whatever that other external app may be. There's obviously other considerations in terms of is that app something that you're getting through the App Exchange? Is that directly on top of Salesforce? Is that an external app, et cetera? But generally speaking, I would do a cross comparison and see if what your organization needs to actually track and be able to track and monitor, if that's being able to be modified or be able to be met from a need standpoint within event monitoring, I would go that route.
One other thing I'd like to point out for those of you who don't know, if you're not familiar with healthcare, if you're not even sure why we even care about event monitoring, is Salesforce natively doesn't have a way to say who's looking or printing data, who's looking at the data or printing the data. So that's what event monitoring is all about, right? And we just use the example of Donna, the nosy neighbor. Event monitoring will actually flag that and let you know. So that's something, if you don't have that context, I want you to be aware. We make sure if we have someone new going, why do I care? That's why you care.
Yeah, absolutely. With that in mind, and Tina, we were actually talking a little bit about this too. So from a event monitoring standpoint, if we go to the next slide, I usually look at it as a proactive approach, but there is an important consideration for event monitoring in terms of capturing and logging and retaining event log files. So in order to potentially report on this, let's say 6 months, a year, et cetera, down the line, the event log files or the events that are actually captured for event monitoring aren't stored in perpetuity. So in order to actually use that in the future, if you need to, and we'll talk about a use case here shortly, but if you need to use that in the future, you might actually want to have a discussion around exporting that data, backing it up, et cetera, from the event log file in and of itself. So a specific use case might be from a healthcare context. If there is a specific event that happens, let's say it's 6 months ago, someone got a procedure or had a surgery, and then they had a complaint associated with that. If that event is related to something that's captured from an event monitoring standpoint, you won't necessarily have that data if it's too far in the past in order to be reported upon based off of the retention policy associated with event monitoring. So in that case, you would want to actually have some of that information stored externally in order to reference it if you need to. Tina, did you want to add any additional context to this? I know that when we were chatting earlier, you had a particular opinion on the log file retention policy.
I think it's just really critical that people understand that they don't think that event monitoring is running and they can go back to it, and that you do have to develop a process. This link, when you get the slide deck, this is to the Heroku site and how you can, it's a free application, and how you can extract the data and store it, because a lot of times patient complaints take a while to bubble up. And you don't see that, and you don't research it until usually well beyond 30 days, or when the patient is getting a survey, says, "Oh, tell us about your experience," and then they start, saying, "Well, this happened." So it's you can't assume that it's a proactive warning if someone's printing out things, but it usually takes quite a while for issues and complaints to be made visible and to do that. So I'm pretty passionate about that, making sure people understand, and a lot of people don't understand that. So there's that. I think I'm also seeing in the chat, fair warning, the App Exchange is a good resort for event monitoring. Amanda, do you want to elaborate on that? Travis, thank you for pointing that out. Amanda, you want to give some more context to that?
Yeah, sure. So Fair Warning are a partner that I've worked with pretty closely over the last few years. They have built out basically additional very much security focused capabilities, lots of great reporting. They do like a kind of a risk builder around each person's profile, and they highlight users that may be indulging in more risky behavior, like for example, exporting large amounts of data. They also provide unlimited data storage, as well as providing a SIM feed. So if you have if there are any customers on the call who are using something called a SIM, a security information and event management tool, like for example, HP ArcSight or Splunk Enterprise Security, they have a kind of a more narrow feed that's more focused on kind of relevant events feed into the SIM, rather than sending all of the event monitoring data in, which is very voluminous. You can do that, but it's probably going to be a lot of noise for your SIM. So yeah, they're a really great partner that I really recommend. Not essential by any means, but it is like a good option. You can just keep the data extracted and stored in any storage, but Fair Warning does a lot of great functionality on top. And then I also wanted to mention, we do have a new architecture in addition to the logs. So natively in Salesforce, you can store some of the events for up to 6 months under the event manager. So we're working on getting all of the events into that new architecture, but if you go to Event Manager and Setup, you can actually enable event storage and store events in 6 months. So that's another option to basically keep your data for longer.
I assume that Salesforce data fees would be applied here.
Actually, no, it's included in event monitoring. So
wow,
that's I would recommend doing. Yeah,
that's a improvement.
Yeah, this is new.
Nice. Yeah, I was gonna say that is nice. So I do want to bubble up something too, though, is that, we know, and this is a very diverse audience. We have customers of Salesforce, and we also have consultants for Salesforce, is that Shield is an add-on. And then when we're talking about RevCult, we're talking about forewarning, they're an additional add-on.
Yeah.
It's really important. You as a customer need to look at what data resources you have available to you and what IT support you have for this, because this infrastructure it can be learned, absolutely, but there is a learning curve to it, and understanding how to not only extract the data, but actually read the data and make it something actionable. So that's where these other apps can help. And it really depends upon what resources you have as an organization that you have to managing, maintaining, and then also when you need to actually review that information is why you're seeing more companies mentioned, because RevCult and Forewarning have developed around that. So I just want to make sure that's aware of that. It's doable, but you just need a certain skill set. Any other questions?
Absolutely. Great. All right, should we move to the main topic that everyone's probably here for.
The big daddy.
Like we got field audit trail, we got event monitoring. That's all cool. Let's talk about platform encryption.
Here we go.
Awesome. So yeah, this is really the star of the show when it comes to Shield as a module and as a product for Salesforce. And the way that I like to approach platform encryption discussions is really thinking about it in two main types, and really it's probabilistic and deterministic. And I'll talk about this from a context of how we typically have conversations with clients or organizations on which you should typically use. I'll start with probabilistic, which I think is by far way more secure than deterministic. I like to think of it as the nuclear option. It's basically a mechanism in which whenever you feed a specific type of data into this pattern of encryption, you're going to get something different out. So if I put my first name into a probabilistic encryption scheme, one time I feed it in, I might get XYZ123 out. Another time I feed it in, I might get ABC789 out. So that random encryption is really, really powerful. But what that does tend to do for some types of features and functionalities, it actually doesn't allow you to use that field as more flexibly as you might like to. So great option if you need to be extremely secure, but there are some considerations that come with it. From a deterministic standpoint, really the difference is if I put my name in, if I put Jordan in, I'm going to get XYZ123 out the first time, I'm going to get it out the second time, I'm going to get it out the third time. And what that allows to happen is to retain some of those features and functionality that you lose with probabilistic encryption. So those specific encryption or those specific features and functionality might be associated with sorting and filtering, things like SQL queries that might be referenced in Apex classes, report filters, things of that nature. But when we approach which scheme we should use, it should really be between choosing probabilistic versus deterministic overall, based off of the specific use case and how secure that data needs to be. So that is a high-level overview between the differences of those two schemes. Within deterministic in and of itself, there's actually a delineation between case insensitivity versus case sensitivity. And when you go to actually implement Shield, what will happen is you create what's called a tenant secret. There's a couple different ways of doing this, but you will select the encryption scheme that you want to use. You can actually set up both a tenant secret for probabilistic encryption as well as deterministic encryption, and then apply those selectively to different fields depending on how secure you need that attribute or that field to be. So the entire setup process is creating that generating that tenant secret, determining which encryption scheme that you want to actually use for that, and then identifying which fields you want to apply that specific encryption mechanism to. Any questions on that? I know that was a lot really quickly from a Shield standpoint. There's more to get into, I promise, but any questions so far on deterministic versus probabilistic?
I have a question. Are there any effects on performance of the application for these encryption, and which one is more efficient?
So performance of the application, so in relation to limitations, the probabilistic, which I mentioned, but from a performance standpoint, I don't have numbers. And maybe Amanda, this is something that you could answer too. I imagine that there is a slight performance impact to fields that are actually deterministically encrypted. And that will likely also differ on if they were case sensitive or case insensitive in terms of which mechanism is used. But when you're actually filtering or sorting based off of SQL, the mechanism has to go through the decryption process and then surface the results after that's done. So I would imagine there's at least some impact to performance overhead when you're using deterministic encryption. Again, with probabilistic, there might be some things that you can't actually do.
Yeah, I think in day-to-day end user experience, it shouldn't be that significant. Where we see the most impact is, for the very, very largest customers in when they're actually encrypting the data, when they're performing the encryption. If it's like, millions and millions of records, that can take time. We actually just released some enhancements in, it was either winter or spring, I can't recall which, one of our most recent releases anyway, to improve that, because we had some really, really large customers come on board, and we basically saw that we needed to break up those jobs to improve the performance. So I think that's where we see the biggest impact, but day to day, it shouldn't be that noticeable for the end user. Doug, like, what would you say? Have you, your feedback from customers, you interact with them a lot as well?
Yeah, definitely. What we hear is, performance impact is minimal, probably not even detectable in the org. So it's barely noticeable, but I would imagine for larger customers that, like you said, Amanda, it would be something they might feel a little bit, but generally our customers do not even feel it.
Yeah, and that's really when the actual encryption is happening. So when you're bulk encrypting, millions of records, when that job is first happening, not in the day to day, like just I'm trying to access a field.
Yeah, and that's good additional context as well. I was thinking about it from the background encryption services, or when you're actually first enabling, but I would agree. I haven't heard of any actual performance issues that are happening on a day-to-day basis for a typical end user. So from an administrative standpoint, when you actually implement, let's say for the first time, what you'll do is that same process that I was outlining, you would generate your tenant secrets, you would apply those to the different fields that you and your team have identified you want to encrypt. And what basically happens at that point is you would run a background encryption service, which will take all the existing data in the org that fits that specific object and those attributes, and it'll re-encrypt, or it'll apply that tenant secret to that data. Moving forward, as data is actually modified in real time, what happens is each time a record is saved to the database, the Shield platform encryption logic will check if that field should be encrypted. If it is, that's when it actually references the tenant secret that it should be using to encrypt it. So that background refresh is basically taking account of everything that was existing in the org prior to enabling platform encryption. And then after those policies are enabled, that'll happen in real time as modifications or creations of records occur. Great question, though. It looks like there's another question from Karen on if there's a list of documentation of types of operations. Yes, there is. So we actually have part of that list on the next slide, which talks about the high-level differences of where you can use encrypted fields from the deterministic encryption mechanism, as opposed to with probabilistic, this is where you wouldn't be able to use them.
Right,
So,
Amanda, I'm sorry, Jordan, let me interrupt for a second. We do need to cover this slide, but also Amanda dropped in a link too as well, if people want to see that link in there in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And that'll be more inclusive than everything here. I think these are the most important ones that I typically have conversations about is, and this is really the reason why I point towards deterministic as the mechanism of choice, in my opinion, is that you can still maintain using a filter within Process Builder, within a SOC query, within any type of Salesforce report, you can still use the sort function, and then using it within list views as well. So filtering and search there, which again, in the probabilistic scheme, you won't be able to maintain that level of functionality. There are still limitations with deterministic encryption. So while it is the better between the two in terms of retaining platform functionality, there are still some aspects of deterministic encryption that impacts platform functionality, such as filtering and flows, the process builder, ordering by, so that operation from a SOC standpoint, when you're trying to aggregate or order records within the context of a query, and some of these other aspects of deterministic encryption and platform functionality.
There's a really good question in the chat around, for encryption strategy, how important is it to consider PHI and Hipaa rules? And is there standard documentation or directives around it?
I don't know if there's a standard documentation or directive around it. Usually when I approach that conversation, it involves IT, business, and compliance or legal for an organization. And A lot of that will depend on how the organization as a whole defines PII. Again, this goes into the context of, how easy is it to identify an individual based off of all the different pieces of data that we have about them. If it's just last name and you're talking about the entire country, that's a little bit different than if in Tina's example, you have last name and zip code, and that zip code corresponds to a small town in Kansas. When you layer on PHI on top of that, I think it becomes a little bit more strict, but I don't know if there's any specific standard documentation or directives. It's usually on an organization by organization basis, because some of those organizations might have different either risk tolerances or definitions of what constitutes PHI, PII, and how they want to handle it, as well as from a business standpoint, what you will or won't be able to do if you use a specific encryption scheme. So I know that's a lot of it depends. I don't know if anyone else on the call has additional perspectives, but that's been my experience so far. Is it's usually defined as a joint conversation between business, IT, legal, and organization.
Yeah, that's 100% Jordan. Yep.
There's two lenses in this. There's two perspectives. If you are a customer of Salesforce and you're looking at acquiring Shield, or you have Shield and you're looking at how to apply that to your Salesforce organization, you want to have at the table, the business, IT, and legal, and you look at your own policies and procedures that are in place as an organization to support HIPAA, your HIPAA policies and procedures, right? As a consultant working with a company, you're going to want to have IT, business, and the legal department at the table to discuss that. But we, as a consultants, never determined. We don't tell the client. The client is saying, "This is our policies and procedures. We need the technology to support and enforce our policies and procedures." And then to Jordan's point, it's different by each organization. So it really, whether you're a consultant or you're the customer, you always have those three people at the table, but it's ultimately supporting the organization's policies and procedures related to how are they enforcing HIPAA. There's not a checklist.
Yeah.
It's not a checklist, guys. It's.
I would agree. I don't know how many times I use the term "I'm not a lawyer" in those conversations, but it comes up very frequently.
Right.
From an approach standpoint, what I usually do is, if you know which objects you have as candidates that you would like to apply platform encryption to, what I'll typically do is I'll do a schema extract, and I'll go through and we'll do a data classification with the client or with the organization that is evaluating what they should be encrypting. We'll take a first pass and we'll say, hey, is any of this roughly considered PHI, PII? We'll take that consolidated list, and then that's what we'll use to facilitate conversations between business, IT, and legal. And as you can imagine, legal, compliance, et cetera, they will take the more conservative approach and say, encrypt everything. And so sometimes that'll work. Most times from a business or IT standpoint, depending on which of these schemes that you'll actually use, that might cause impacts to what you'll use the data for, or what you'd like to be able to use the data for. So it becomes a balancing act upon which you say, all right, well, we want to be able to use this data for X, Y, Z, for this use case, for this specific activation, for whatever that is. And when business can demonstrate a need for that, that's where I've seen business be successful in saying, hey, IT and legal, this should remain either unencrypted, or we should use a less restrictive encryption mechanism to apply to it, because we need to retain it for using filters in a SQL query, things of that nature. And throughout that entire process, what will happen when you actually go to implement platform encryption is there's validation that happens when you actually try to apply it to a specific field. And so let's take a scenario. In ideal world, this doesn't happen because you've done all the conversations, you know exactly how everything is going to be used with platform encryption. But let's say I take a social security number and I want to encrypt that with probabilistic encryption. Let's say for some reason I'm using social security number in an Apex class in a SQL statement. If I try to enable that, there's a validation that says when I press save, Shield will actually say, hey, this is actually used in a SQL statement. You don't want to do that. So there are some safeguards that are built in from a Shield standpoint to help facilitate those conversations so that when you're talking with legal and IT, you have a better understanding of what this actually means from an implication standpoint when you're implementing.
That is a lot. I want to point out something that I thought was really fascinating, and I had eyeballed this, and I don't think a lot of us are using this, is that when you go into the object to the field, you do have a compliance categorization that you can actually start identifying in your orgs. So that could be also really useful as you're going through and you're identifying and you're wanting to basically track everything. I thought that was really nice that Salesforce had added that, and that's the context that you can end up doing with that as you're trying to do your inventory. A little random note, but I always like those little small tidbits.
Definitely.
Mike DeMaria, I hopefully pronounced that correctly. You're starting to implement encryption, have about 150 to 200 potential fields. Well, it depends on your use case.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, it's not really unusual to have hundreds of fields encrypted, or a lot of customers just have like 5 and that's it.
What might be helpful is how many total fields are in the org. So like from a percentage standpoint, that might be a little bit more indicative. I will say 150 to 200 sounds a little bit high. Again, not a lawyer, don't know the org itself, but it sounds high on my experience.
It depends. They can be doing, they can be a medical research firm. So what is, Mike,
Sure.
what industry are we talking here?
Life insurance and finance.
Finance. Doug, Amanda, have you seen, it's possible. What have you, with your implementations, Doug, what have you seen as a norm?
We don't encourage to encrypt that much within the database or within the system. Generally, when you think of encryption, you think of de-identifying things, certainly for HIPAA, there's only, I forget what it was, like 50 fields or 40 fields, I think it was, Tina, that you mentioned before, that need to be encrypted. So, we don't recommend it because the more you encrypt, the more you're going to run into those little problems that Jordan was talking about before, right? So really think about what you need to encrypt. And, a lot of my customers are driven by compliance, and there's a compliance team that's actually telling them to encrypt these fields because of this compliance need. But also, protecting the company jewels is something that's important as well. So,
yeah. One other consideration, Mike, is the number of objects that's split across. If that's, 150 to 200 split across, let's say 25 or 50 objects, you're talking about a couple per object. That's a little bit less intrusive from a functionality standpoint than maybe every single, field that you can encrypt on a, account object, something of that nature. So that's another consideration to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I know, and I just can't wait till I get into, with the business people and start getting into big arguments about functionality,
Sure.
between me and the security.
Yeah.
So 2 other really good questions came into the chat, and I know Tina's gonna mention something about time in a second, but I think both of these are good ones to mention. The first one is around, will platform encryption be deterministic in the existing backup and archival processes? And then can encryption be undone later and rolled back?
Those are perfect questions. I'm actually kind of suspicious because I was waiting for these to come in, and it's going to look like Karen and Nasir are paid actors in the audience. But we actually do have a slide about the kind of encryption timeline for rotating keys. So to answer the first one, so will platform encryption be deterministic in the existing backup and archival process? For rotating keys, what will happen is, from a key lifecycle standpoint, you generate your tenant secret, and you can move to the next slide if you want to, Tina. You'll generate that tenant secret. Again, you'll select the encryption scheme that you want to use, whether that's probabilistic, deterministic, case insensitive, case sensitive. And then generally speaking, the next step after that, which I always recommend, which is going to answer Karen's question, is exporting that tenant secret. So after that key is generated within Salesforce, I would recommend exporting that tenant secret, keeping it someplace safe outside of Salesforce so that you have a backup in case a tenant secret gets destroyed. That should never really happen. There's security policies in place that you can put there so that doesn't happen or has less risk of happening. But you'll generate the tenant secret, you'll export it, you'll evaluate the selected fields for encryption, you'll run the background encryption services. That's the process that I was talking about, where you have to account for existing data in the database. And then after all of that's done, let's say you're going to wait some time. Let's say 2-3 months go by. You might look at the encryption statistic page within Shield to actually confirm that encryption mechanism has been applied to the 100% of the records that you're anticipating it to be applied to. And so when you start to mix different keys or versions of keys as you're rotating them out, that's when you'll start to come into the conversation of how do we roll back? How do we actually decrypt records that are encrypted using an older version of a key? That's all possible. You just have to know which key is actually being used for the record that is encrypted. So can it be undone or rolled back? Yes. In the case that you have that encryption, that generated tenant secret, either still in Salesforce, it can be an archived key. It can still be used to decrypt the records that it was previously encrypting, as long as it hasn't been destroyed. So if you destroy a tenant secret in Shield, you won't be able to use that specific key to decrypt data within Salesforce. And that's why I recommend step 2A is exporting that tenant secret, because in that case, if you do have a backup of it, you can bring it back into Salesforce. You can then unencrypt the data that was previously encrypted using that key, but it is possible. So that's all around kind of the key lifecycle. Very quick. I know we're on time. I'm going extra quickly because I'm about to get the hook off the stage. But that is an overview of kind of the key lifecycle and the key rotation process as a whole. Any questions on that?
I bet there's a lot of questions on this. Thank you so much, Jordan. So I do want to make sure we give time, because we have Amanda and Doug here. We can continue the conversations in the success community. There is actually a Shield customer success community page, so we definitely want to have that. So we're going to go ahead and pivot now to, so resources. We have the Salesforce Shield Accelerator. It's 2 hours. It is, it covers all three. But there is a very, very in-depth event monitoring accelerator. I actually recommend you watch both. They're great. They're fantastic to get in and start getting an understanding of Trailhead. Obviously, secure your apps to Salesforce Shield. And there is a Salesforce Shield learning map available to anyone and everyone. So when you get this deck, you can click on the link and you can get here. And it's another great training tool to take you through the processes. Thank you so much, Amanda and Doug, for being here and for your insight. Jordan, thank you so much for stepping us through everything. We really appreciate it. Corinne can totally tell you how much she loves this topic. She's the she's the security nerd among us three. And but we're so appreciative of y'all being here. We're looking at our next steps is March. We're doing the release review, Spring 21. We're going to have open sessions on Health Cloud. And there are some things that were said to come out in winter and didn't, and now they announced Nazzara for document management, the OCR functionality. It looks like it's finally here. So we're probably going to revisit some of the winter release that's actually now available to us. April is patient provider communities. Corinne's going to be kicking that off and giving us a lot of insight there. And then in May, we're going to be looking at the call centers, right? That Patient 360 realized. So please, if you haven't yet, sign up in our community. Continue the conversation. You can see us in the success community. And you can email me on the Trailblazer. You can email Mel and Corinne as well. But really go to the community. Usually keep an eye on things there. In the community, we're going to post a link to the YouTube recording as well as the slide deck. And that is it. I think we are wrapping up. We have 1 minute left. Amanda's sliding one more thing. Another hot off the press note. Real-time event monitoring was just, ooh, nice. Real-time event monitoring was added to the Shield Trailhead. Great. So the education and what is available to us is becoming much more robust. And I really appreciate Amanda and Doug that you will be also monitoring the success community, because there is the official Shield success community. There is actually an official Salesforce Health Cloud. And then you have Mel, Corinne, and I in the healthcare user group. So anything that y'all need to follow up on, please let us know. And it's 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And I look forward to, Mel, Corinne, and I look forward to seeing everyone again next month. Thank you all.